Dear participants, we are starting the third panel, and I'm pleased to introduce the co-moderator of today's event, Teodor Moga, who is a project advisor. The floor is yours.
Nadia, thank you very much for this opportunity to moderate such a challenging panel. My name is Teodor Moga. I am from the Alexandru Ioan Cuza University of Iași, Romania, and as Nadia mentioned, project advisor in this initiative. Nadia, thank you very much for giving me the impression that I'm wiser by naming me project advisor. So, the topic of today's panel is very challenging, as you know. Is entitled Decentralization and Mobility in the Post-Communist State. And for such a challenging topic, we have two fine gentlemen, two experts who will, by all means, look into this issue and give you a lot of recommendation, a lot of their expertise. And without further ado, I would like to present you the two speakers. First is Benjamin Tallis, Dr. Benjamin Tallis, who is a research fellow at the Institute of International Relations and the coordinator of Institute Center for European Studies. Benjamin is also the editor-in-chief of the academic journal New Perspective, interdisciplinary journal of Central and Eastern European politics and international relations. Benjamin did his PhD at an university which is very close to my heart, University of Manchester, where I also did a couple of years ago my master's program, my MA. He has also previously worked as a strategy planning and performance officer at the European Border Assistance Mission to Moldova and Ukraine. Benjamin, I'm right, I hope. And also project manager for the EU Police mission, EUPOL Proxima, in Skopje, in Macedonia. So Benjamin not only has a broad academic experience, but also a practical one from the field. The other distinguished speaker we have today is Dr. Mihailo Pavliuk. He's an assistant professor at the Department of International Relations at Chernivtsi National University, Ukraine. He previously did his PhD at the University in Chernivtsi, and among many other interests he has, he's also a member of the regional working group on decentralization and member of the Chernivtsi Regional Council Commission on problems examining the trans-border cooperation project, among other things. So, Mihailo, if I may, has also broad practical experience in the field. Without further ado, I'm quite pressed by the main organizers here to push the agenda, because we are 15 minutes behind the schedule. I have minutes, I have smiles here. So, gentlemen, I don't know who would like to start, but the floor is yours. Benjamin, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, Teodor. Thanks for such a nice introduction, and many thanks also to Nadia for the invitation to participate today. We at the Institute of International Relations in Prague are extremely happy that we can be a partner on this project and could help get the Visegrad funding for what is an extremely worthwhile and important exercise. And I'm very happy that Nadia has emphasized to us today that this is the beginning of something rather than the culmination of something. So I have styled my remarks to that effect as provocations to further thought, further engagement, interaction and inquiry. As Teodor mentioned, I've worked in the practice as well as the study of international relations, international politics, particularly for the European Union, including here in Ukraine. But this is my first time in Chernivtsi, so I'm very happy to be here in a region that encapsulates so many of the challenges that we continue to face of Europeanization, European integration, dealing with our differences, our conflicting pasts, identities, languages and cultures, but also the opportunities that we can take to do so. So we're in an appropriate setting for an important topic. Just one note that in Prague, our centre is the Centre for European Security. So I come to you today to speak from something of a security perspective, but I hope it will not be a traditional security perspective, as I will explain further on. Just to quickly note also the journal that Theodor mentioned, New Perspectives. I am indeed the editor-in-chief of this academic journal, which we are looking for submissions for. So do bear us in mind for your academic articles, intervention pieces, which are polemics that we seek to, through which we seek to advance debate on relevant contemporary issues for Central and Eastern Europe. So remember, the journal's name is New Perspectives, and we are listed in Scopus, so you get plenty of research points for publishing with us. Okay, so on to the actual subject of today's presentation, if I may. As we make our own journey from inspiration to implementation. Excellent, that seems, everyone can see and everyone can hear. Yeah, okay, great. So, yeah, indeed, the title of today's workshop is From Inspiration to Implementation, Europeanization in, and I would add, of, Ukraine. But that comes with some caveats, as we will see. Yeah, just for anyone who didn't get my name or so on, it's Dr. Benjamin Tallis, and I look forward to continuing discussion with you after the presentations, which my presentation today will look in 4 stages. One, at the context we are operating in this project in the wider terms, and particularly of this panel which deals with mobility and decentralization. And I'm going to explain to you the context of my own research a little bit, but also why I choose to focus on mobility. And as I understand it, Mikhailo is going to focus more on decentralization, so it's almost like we planned this. Then we're going to go on to the research context and framework that I use to explore some of the questions about mobility and about Europeanization in relation to Ukraine and also to the V4. Then look at what I call the Central and East European borderscape, which is a way of understanding borders, security, mobility and identity in Central and Eastern Europe. So I advance an analytical framework through which then to analyze what I call post-frontier bordering, or the complexity of bordering that we see after the Schengen zone in the context of European neighbourhood policy and Eastern Partnership. And having done that, having identified some of the key features, discourses and practices of this borderscape, I reflect a little on possible recommendations, as well as on conclusions for identities, borders and orders in the EU and Ukraine, and potential ways forward. So, next slide, please. As Theodor mentioned, I have something of a long engagement with Ukraine and with Ukrainian mobility, having worked here for the EU Border Assistance Mission based in Odessa, but dealing with issues countrywide. Focusing on mobility rather than decentralization, as I mentioned in this presentation, gives us the opportunity to look at identities, borders and orders, to look at governance and subjectivity. And this came to me as a key topic through my practical experience of working for the EU and seeing how much the issue of mobility affected and impacted on the lives of the Ukrainians who I lived and worked with on a daily basis, but also how much it affected positively the lives of those Central and East Europeans who were from states that were already members of the EU and in particular the Schengen zone, and to explore the contrast between their experiences and their relations to Europe through the lens of mobility. We've been set this task, which, as I mentioned, we're at the beginning rather than the end of looking to go from the inspiration of the V4 to implementation. So the inspiration is clear. It's the free movement that people within the V4 countries can enact because of their membership in Schengen and membership in the European Union. This has very clear practical benefits for leisure, for work, the possibility to just nip across the border to Dresden, to go to the art galleries, to Vienna, to go to the opera, to Munich for shopping, etc. is very clear from citizens of Czech Republic. In Poland, similar experience. You can travel freely. Other members of the Schengen zone experience the same thing. There's key practical benefits, but moreover, there are also benefits in terms of the psychosocial element of belonging within the European Union. This is a key enactment of European citizenship. It's a key enactment of EU-European life. However, we know, unfortunately, that membership of the Schengen zone and the EU is off the table for Ukraine, in the medium term at least. So if we're talking about inspiration to implementation, the key aspect that the V4 has been able to take advantage of is indeed membership. So I propose, rather than talking about inspiration to implementation, in the medium term we need to be talking about imitation and about how to enact some of the characteristics of European or Europeanized mobility rather than the formal structures that allow these freedoms of movement to exist for citizens of, for example, Czech Republic and Poland. We might question in the current context what to imitate, because as we know, the conduct of the V4 has been at the heart of the migration crisis in Europe. We may even, sadly, as Mark Rutte and Manuel Valls were asking in Davos yesterday, we might ask if there will be anything left to imitate if we see a potential collapse of the Schengen zone and indeed we see a European Union riven with crisis. Putting that to one side for the moment, I proceed in this idea that we should be thinking about initially from inspiration to imitation before perhaps we go forward onto implementation. One note quickly on Europeanization. Ukraine is already European. Ukrainians are Europeans, this we know. So what I'm not talking about is not the existential status of people here, nor the European status of Ukraine. What I mean in this term, to be very clear, is EU-European. And I think we need to move away from a situation where the European Union can colonize this term European in its entirety, and we need to claim it back in a variety of ways. As I mentioned, the key aspects of EU-European mobility are these rights to mobility that come from free movement within the Schengen borderless zone. But as we know, it's not entirely borderless, for one thing, but it is considered to be an area of freer movement, but also an area of security and justice. It implies certain kinds of governance implications, which are also key aspects of European Union membership that Ukrainians often indicate they wish to imitate and wish to benefit from. Membership of the Schengen zone, implementation of the criteria of the area of freedom, security and justice, as well as wider conditions of European Union membership, have allowed the V4, and this is a key conclusion of my own research, have allowed the V4 to move from a situation of a hierarchical relationship, new Europeans, non-core Europeans, etc., to exercise full belonging within the EU. So this is again part of this psychosocial element to membership of Schengen and enacting free movement. As I mentioned, this was achieved through formal membership, which we know is off the table. But this double accession process was effected through attitudes and actions of the EU. So we need to think about how the V4 influenced the attitudes and actions of the EU, but also actions and attitudes of the V4 themselves. So we can also think about how Ukraine treats its own attitudes and actions in this regard. So, sorry, next slide, please. Thank you. As we mentioned, formal membership off the table, but what we can see perhaps is that visa liberalisation is a key to imitating aspects of European mobility in the medium term. Freer, if not free movement, into the EU and Schengen states. Ability to exercise then the freer movement within Schengen states as well. That is a key benefit from being within that zone. But also to see EU-Europe for oneself, to be able to see and experience how the EU works, what kind of governance structures it has, how this plays out on the street in a daily basis. What is it like to study at a university in the EU? What is it like to work in an EU business? Why would we want to take this back to Ukraine with us? Why would we want to imitate other parts of this? But as well as just visa liberalisation, we can think of, indeed, work, study, business, and types of exchanges as key aspects of EU mobility that Ukrainians should perhaps seek to imitate. However, we also need to think about mobility going the other way. We need to think about the types of mobility that are enacted from EU states into Ukraine. We can think of tourism and different types of tourism, types of business, types of study, and also further types of exchanges, as well as government consultation and advice. Thank you. Next slide, please. So what is to be done? Well, we mentioned these actions and attitudes on each side, and how Ukrainians can take action, what is in their possibility to influence, but also what the EU needs to do. What I propose to you is that in order to understand what we need to do from each side, as it might be put, or from each party, we need to understand the situation better. This also means understanding the factors in favour of Europeanising mobility and the factors against, both within Ukraine as well as within the European Union, and in the wider context of international relations, which several people have already discussed today. In order to do just this task of deeper understanding, I conducted research into this borderscape, as I put it, of Central and Eastern Europe. Later, I'll draw on these conclusions to suggest some actions that we can potentially take. But first of all, I'm going to outline what this borderscape is, why to use it, and then what it is constituted of in Central and Eastern Europe. So, next slide, please. What I talk about, and this is the second section, and next slide again, please, is that in the context of post-frontier bordering, borders that have escaped the territorial shackles of the traditional frontier and have escaped throughout the Schengen zone, have been exported partly into the European neighbourhood through neighbourhood policy and Eastern Partnership, and no longer take place in the same kind of fixed locations that we used to see. We need a new analytical framework to understand this dynamism that is in contrast to traditional border studies that focuses on frontiers and borders as fixed lines. Next slide, please. We can see this complexity in critiques of the Schengen zone, which it's not universally celebrated. There's many critical literatures that actually discuss the Schengen zone in terms of the fact it might have created trans-European networks of control through the use of roaming police patrols, police checks in factories, offices, residency checks, and so on, roving customs officers and customs patrol, inland border policing. We can also see that there have been questions about the ability to effect this type of European belonging for the four countries, although, as I mentioned, I conclude that actually they have been able to do so through participating in these Schengen frameworks. A clearer distinction we can see is between those that are members and those countries that remain neighbours or partners. The European Neighbourhood Policy was initiated as a ring of friends by Romano Prodi, but has also been criticised as potentially creating a buffer zone. What we see here, in this context of post-Cold War Europe and the context of European integration, which has happened more for some than for others, is both debordering and rebordering. And we see in both instances a way to examine European values and interests in principle, but also in practice, and so how they actually play out. Next slide, please. To understand this type of complexity, this deterritorialization and the dispersion of borders, this dynamism that they have, we've seen a lot of change in borders rather than fixity, I propose that we take the framework of the borderscape, which is initially set out by some anthropologists, Prem Kumar Rajaram, Carl Grundy-War, Subendrini Pereira, etc., in their collection of the same name from 2007, and we update it. Crucially, this borderscape idea was a way to get away from the fixity of the map and the fixity of understanding populations within boundaries as containers. So this very old idea of borders, which one that still continued to permeate international relations well into the 1990s and 2000s, as Rob Walker, John Agnew, and many others have pointed out. But what actually is this borderscape? Well, the key for understanding it to me came through a link to landscape. And here we see Peter Bruegel's one of his wonderful landscape season paintings. The reason I use that should become clearer in a second. Next slide, please. The anthropologist Tim Ingold talks about Bruegel's paintings as a way to understand landscape. Again, not just a fixed view of a fixed situation, but that we should see the landscape as an array of related features, but also an array of related tasks and activities. The activity-scape or task-scape that is constituting the picture that we see. I take this link, both related features and related tasks, and add, from a lot of critical international relations theory, arrays of related discourses. So what I claim, working in the tradition of Michel Foucault, Bruno Latour, Pierre Bourdieu, and others who have influenced international political sociology, is that we can understand a borderscape as a series of related arrays of features, practices, and discourses that are related inherently to security and mobility and the intersection of the two. Now, this understanding has spatial, temporal, and socio-political underpinnings, and I'm happy to talk about any more of this in questions, depending on what people are interested in. But also it has contingencies and consequences for identities, borders, orders, the IBO, and for governance and subjectivity, so it directly impacts on what we are talking about today. Unfortunately, it's rather obscured behind me, but this draws on critical security studies. No, I'm not going to be able to shift out of the way of that. Critical security studies, particularly the Copenhagen School and Paris School, for those who know it, international political sociology, but it goes outside of IR. It looks also at critical geography. It looks at the politics of history and memory. It looks at anthropology, and also I use certain ethnographic techniques in order to explore this borderscape. Also, it draws on the wide literature of Central and East European studies and EU studies, so it's a highly interdisciplinary investigation. Next, please. So what is this Central European, East European borderscape then, which I termed a movable east? Next slide, please. On to section 3, and one more further. Thank you. Well, if we look at these related arrays of features, discourses, and practices, what I claim is that we can see an archipelago of features, a diversity of features, which I'll describe in a second, which are nonetheless related and make sense in relation to each other. In terms of discourses, I describe the overall pattern of discourses as similar to Euroremont or Euro renovations, for those who are familiar with this particular design style that was popular across the former Soviet world in the 90s and 2000s, and you'll know the particular characteristics of that Euroremont. But also practices, and looking at how practices of bordering provide limits to Europe and Europeanness. So, I will talk about this. This is part of a wider study that looked at the Czech Republic, Poland, and Ukraine, but I'm going to speak specifically about the things that are most applicable to Ukraine today. So, next slide, please. In terms of features in this border archipelago, this diverse array of sites, forms, and functions of bordering, we can see that internally, these firewalls and shadows about internal control and about the remnants of Schengen bordering. Those are more for inside Schengen. When we come to understanding Ukrainian bordering and mobility, it's important we get our critique of the border right. There's so much critique that says we are facing Fortress Europe. However, I put it to you, this is not a fortress. It does not have the architecture of a fortress. The fact that more than 1 million Ukrainians per year can get Schengen visas doesn't again sound like fortress-like bordering. And the fortress critique obscures what are the real restrictions on Ukrainian mobility, which are real and are damaging. So don't think I'm underestimating that, but we have to get our critique right. I'll come on to that critique in a second. But what we also can see at this border is the existence of local border traffic agreements, which allow enhanced mobility for people who live within up to 50 kilometers of the border zone, and traveling without visa and without getting stamps in passports. Significant advances in mobility. These local border traffic agreements, 3 minutes. Oh my goodness, am I running out of time? Yes, I am. Okay. So, local border traffic agreements. We should use these as a model, basically. The enhanced border protection actually can facilitate enhanced mobility, which seems counterintuitive, but isn't, and I'll have to explain more on that. We need to look at the EU's visa regime, which I describe as a curtain wall. It's look but don't touch. Remote control consular procedures, and building an idea of Ukraine as second-class Europe that we also need to challenge. Furthermore, we can see this twisted mirror of EU bordering, when the EU creates Ukraine not only as a buffer zone, but as this uncanny or unheimlich borderland, where it is both the scene of the EU's salvation as a foreign and security actor, but also a site and source of its problems. It is both similar and different, and therefore has a haunting effect that spooks the EU. In terms of discourses, crucially we can see discourses, next slide please, sorry. Shared values and interests as a key discourse, from ring of friends to friends with benefits, we might say. We can also see a divergence in values and interests, and this is used to justify a division. So we need to think about that as well. We see securitization of the neighborhood through threats, the exposition of threats in the neighborhood, but also through fears of the East, what the Ukrainian artist Nikita Kadan referred to as the devils in Western minds. So I will go on to the next. Go moving quickly, please. In terms of practices, crucial practices we need to understand. Practices of knowing, how we know borders and mobility through risk analysis. This distorts the way we understand mobility. Practice of protecting, both of protecting borders and protecting migrants, which may have contradictory effects. Practices of facilitating movement through visa facilitations, enhanced travel possibilities for certain groups, but also the practices of movement that people enact. Why do people from the EU come to Ukraine? Particular kinds of tourism. Unfortunately, we can see that one of the first things you arrive at the Lviv airport is an advert for one of the largest strip clubs in Ukraine. This is indicative to an extent of practices of sex tourism that also go on in Ukraine and reflect certain intra-Ukrainian difficulties with regard to social relations in that regard, but also affects the perception of Ukraine in Western minds. Okay, really skipping through to the potential conclusions and possible recommendations, and apologies for running over time. Loose conclusions, which as I say are supposed to be somehow provocative and challenge you to respond, are that clear divisions do remain. I think we all can all see that, between EU-European and East European possibilities of movement. V4 show the possibility that these can be overcome, and that mobility is a key factor. But we face a situation where the EU itself has a crisis of identity, a crisis of confidence, and currently a crisis of mobility. So we're operating in very difficult times. Despite this, I claim imitation still remains attractive. And implementation and integration should be followed in the longer run, but in the short term, imitation is key. Final slides, please. I point to a series of ways which we can challenge these features, discourses, and practices by understanding their contingencies. By, for example, in discourses, challenging ignorance and xenophobia of Western Europeans about Ukraine, where we can see a key role for the V4 in that. The need to engender sympathy and generosity of the kind that was shown to the V4. And to guilt the EU into doing more than its rational interests might suggest it should. And so there's a series of those different recommendations, which again I can talk about more later. Very finally, what we can put this in the context of, and there's one more slide, apologies to skip through quickly, but yeah, we have to see this in the context of EU's own crises. But also there are opportunities here. The revision of key EU policies and strategies, neighbourhood policy, Eastern Partnership, but also the transformation of the European security strategy into a European global strategy on foreign and security policy offers opportunities for desecuritizing mobility. So, we heard also earlier the return to geopolitical thinking, the return to realism, as Adam put it, potentially creates problems in this regard, a return to interest-based thinking, but we need to remember that values also remain part of the discussion and that we can influence mobility through that. So, thank you very much indeed. Some ideas there, as I say, to provoke more discussion. I'm very happy to take comments, questions on either the analysis or the proposed actions. Thank you very much indeed.
Fascinating. Thank you very much. Sorry for being so strict all the time, but I have very harsh rules from above. Yeah, and I have to remind you that we are the only ones standing before the lunch break, so the pressure is quite increasing. So without further ado, we'll keep the same structure, and I would invite our next speaker, Mihailo, to give us his take on decentralization. Of course, technical issues. I'm not the guy dealing with this one. Perhaps you can help me to speed up the process, which is in presentation.
So I'll try my best to cope in time.
Mihailo, I will be the bad guy, and I have to show you the time again.
Okay, thank you very much for your welcome, distinguished partners, friends, colleagues. It's my great pleasure to be invited for such scientific event, our workshop, which is organized by the Scientific NGO Quadrivium and my friends Nadia, Ina, and you guys really are doing a great job here in Chernivtsi and in Ukraine. You do all that what our local authority should do for the first time when they start to think about any Europeanization process in Ukraine or in particular in Chernivtsi. I'm pleased to be here at this very day of 22nd of January. We have today a unity today, and shall we talk about the decentralization at the Unity Day? Of course we shall. Of course we shall, and I have reasons why we should talk
at least
about,
for the record here.
about this. My first idea is to say that over the last few years, Ukraine has undergone historical changes, including revolution of dignity, annexation of Crimea Peninsula, the election of a new president and parliament, with formation, not very easy, but still with the formation of pro-European coalition, establishment of a government that all those are supposed to be dedicated to democratic reforms and reach criteria to NATO and European Union membership. They all proclaim different reforms, for example, 2020 agenda, the coalition treaty, so on, and among them the decentralization was proclaimed as top priority, and it's supposed to be among key reforms which requires Ukraine and our society from the early 1990s. Please, next slide. Because from one hand, the reform number one in Ukraine should open many really new abilities, new opportunities for building strong civil society, for fighting overwhelming corruption. We'll talk about this later on, political corruption in Ukraine, which hampers actually decentralization. And actually make authority, make local authority, as well as community members more responsible for the most essential issues. All these institutes, they can support decentralization. And next slide, please. And at the same time, on the other hand, we have institutes which hamper decentralization. For several years, despite of the total administrative bureaucracy inherited from the Soviet past, we unfortunately have many bureaucracy procedures which hamper any reform, yes, and in particular decentralization reform. And in spite of that fact that according to recent polls, more than 60%, it's according to Rosenkow Center, more than 60% of Ukraine, they support decentralization. They support decentralized form in Ukraine. But still we have many problems which hamper this, which reduce the step-by-step implementation of this reform. And before saying about these institutes, we should remember that as Orange and Euromaidan activists, as activists which took part in 1990s revolution, really social groups, local communities, and the already from pro-European coalition, they have to do as much as possible to unite Ukrainian people, unite Ukrainian authority to finish this decentralization reform. Next slide, please. But what really hampers, yes, decentralization is, as I already said, the bureaucracy, which is interconnected with all institutes which I already said. It also negligible negative Russian propaganda which we face over the last many years. Not last 2 or 3 years, because it's obvious right now for many people that it exists and it's brutally negligible. It's just simply lying for the people. But it used to be even earlier in the beginning of 1990s, through political parties, through counterparts from the different parts of Ukraine, through activists from different so-called movements. For example, we can remember Medvedchuk movement, who was an agent #1 of the Kremlin propaganda. The Next thing which hampers decentralization is lack of well-prepared staff. That's the great problem for our local authority, because we actually proclaimed a very hard reform, very unuseful for Ukrainian to wage all the aspects of this reform, but we at the same time have to teach and study as quick as possible activists, staff, people who should be ready for the public service, and of course all those, they form a core of decentralization in local communities. Next thing is next point is about the populist case. That's the problem which has had influence on many states, in particular Central and European states, when the political parties don't want to take responsibility for the unpopular but still very essential reforms in Ukraine. So we face many rumors, many stereotypes. By the way, actually, as well as it used to be with the Ukrainian NATO integration and public campaign efforts, it used to be many stereotypes, many rumors to undergone to say that's not true, that's completely out of mind, when politicians used to say about NATO-Ukraine integration. And nowadays we all understand that if it were more closer ties and accession talks more successful, we wouldn't have such problems now in Ukraine concerning national security questions and so on and so forth. The influence of oligarchs and their allies is completely unmanageable in our country due to the total amount of enterprises and benefits they have really in our national economy, and this absolutely not democratic, liberal economy deals with political corruption, and it means that no one of them wishes to see self-sufficient communities, independent communities with active people, active citizens working inside this community. And that's why they hamper the discussion about decentralization, using their national TV channels, usually broadcasting that this reform is for any political party or any political leader, which I believe is not true, because if we talk about decentralization as well as democratization as well as Europeanization, it's for the whole nation, for the whole country. And the last but not the least, it's weak internal integration of people, it's mistrust, it's maybe lack of idea of national interest, and finally it's sometimes lack of responsibility before what are you doing, whom you are supporting, what kind of political actions do you support, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. But I believe that talking about this, we slightly start to understand what is really the decentralization for active Ukrainians, for me, for example, for Ukrainian people on the whole. Is it only authority or financial capabilities? When usually sometimes they try to show. If we say officially, yes, decentralization means delegating considerable authority and budgets from the state bodies to the bodies of local self-governments, to entrust as much authority as possible to the bodies operating closest to public, where this authority can be exercised most successfully, yes? But the key concept proclaims that decentralization is once created opportunity for self-sufficient communities to determine what political, infrastructural, and financial agenda should be proposed and implemented on their local level. So, you know, it's opportunities and possibilities. That's possibilities, repeated Joe Biden just a few days ago in Davos. And it doesn't matter, he was talking about 1960s in America for finding a job, or we are talking about building self-sufficient communities in Ukraine. That's about possibilities. Next slide, please. And what does really decentralization requires? It actually requires opportunities, yes, for these self-sufficient communities. It requires civil duties and decision-making process enrollment. You know, we already said that more than 60% of Ukrainians support decentralization, but that also means they should be responsible and they should take part in civil duties. Next slide, yeah. In order to control the local community agenda. I already said that in Ukraine the corruption system will fail on that very moment when active and responsible citizens respecting rule of law, individual rights and sharing European values will do everything possible to defeat political corruption, yes? And the most dangerous and rooted kind of corruption, I said it already, political corruption, will lose a solid foundation and basis, because well-informed, well-sufficient community is a real challenge for oligarchs. And one remark, of course, if to speak about corruption, maybe there is any need to talk more about the political corruption, but maybe the idea of Maidan, Euromaidan 3, yes, the third period, is a problem of political parties, usually political leaders, but for people, the question of fighting corruption can really unite and make them support any public actions in order to fight this this brutal thing. We talk about political corruption and slightly go to decentralization and constitutional process. Not because the constitution is the core of law system, yes, but at the same time because the constitution and decentralization should finally write out all measurements of this reform. And the adoption of constitution in Ukraine in 1996 declared, by the way, a combination of centralization and decentralization in exercising authority, but only partly, and that's also an interesting thing because it just proclaimed the idea of decentralization, but didn't write anything about ability, about denoting the right and ability as it used to be written in fundamental charter of local self-government. And starting from 1996, actually, we had to build different bills, to pass different bills on state level with regard to the decentralization. But at the same time, it wasn't done, and only a bill was passed a year ago about self-sufficient community. So it's like 10 years passed, and you know, that's really strange. The constitution process must bring absolutely new distribution, and here are two important elements of power within central and local to make local sufficient communities more important, yes, and more responsible, and at the same time to clearly put out about the discussion about European or Euro-Atlantic agenda. And the combination of these 2 points, I believe, will be useful as for decentralized Ukraine, and talks about decentralization, as for organizing and making European focus and European prosperity in Ukraine. I believe that no any other reason to abrogate constitution or installation of special status of any part of territory of sovereign Ukraine can be possible. It's very tough to discuss this topic nowadays, because many politicians speak that the idea of constitution process is to make Ukraine more weak, and some even say to federalize its system, to make federalization. We can talk about this, but these ideas, these aspects which I support and which support many my colleagues, they have nothing to deal with this. Next slide, please. Decentralization and local governance should be a top important thing due to several reasons. Because we just had local elections, re-elected local councils. In short term, they should form effective executive committees and implement regional roadmap of decentralization. First steps we already taken. We have 10 new commerce, 10 new local sufficient communities. 28 should be passed in the nearest future. But the main thing is that local self-governance should be clearly organized by re-elected members of local parliaments. I used to be twice a member of local parliament, and I'm not eager to become again in such system, but I'm clearly eager to support all these changes in self-governance on a local level, because I know why those deputies come to the board. I know why do they visit sessions, and unfortunately I understand what they are looking for and what they are waiting for. And this reform is a good possibility. This decentralization is a good possibility to change attitude of deputies to their main agendas and main responsibilities. And last slide is because we believe that the best proof of local deputies and the realization of all aspects of decentralization should be quick and undeliberate realization of Euromaidan ideas, and decentralization reform should be independent roll call voting, compulsory session and committees attendance, which is absolutely normal and obvious in Europe, but sometimes not obvious in our case. Accessibility and accountability before local communities, and so on and so forth. So, going back to the final remarks, next slide, I want to say the following, that all these aspects, step by step, should approach us to the goal of our ambitious reforms, to share European values, to achieve European standards, and to prepare to be able in 2020 to apply for EU membership. These words sound notably with outstanding sense, especially today, when 97 years ago Ukrainians struggled for unification of Eastern and Western Ukraine in 1919. I also believe that supporting such discussions and feeling this reform on a new level, I believe that next time we can meet here and speak not about only V4 but the V4 plus 1. Thank you very much.
Mihailo, thank you very much for this excellent account of the decentralization topic in Ukraine. I know we are running out of time, or already time is up, but I won't forgive myself if I am not opening the floor for some questions. So, Nadia, I hope next time you will also invite me. If not, I understand. Guys, please, I see a question in the second row, then Adam next. Please.
Thank you.
Julia.
Actually, I have two questions for both speakers. Benjamin, we unfortunately skipped the last slide due to the lack of time, but you mentioned some mechanisms of EU policy revision. First of all, how do you see the revision of Eastern Partnership policy? Is the Eastern Partnership format still alive? Because it is highly discussed for the last 2-3 years. Before Vilnius summit in 2013, we all were sure that the association agreement between Ukraine and the European Union will be signed, while EU needs success story. Now you mentioned that EU still needs a success story, but what do you think about the revision of Eastern Partnership format? And the question to Mihailo, which stereotypes do you usually face in decentralization process in Cherkasy region? And is there any special approach to maybe perception of decentralization process in the districts populated with national minorities and in other districts? Because in Odessa we have such experience, we conducted such a kind of research on different perception of decentralization process in south of Odessa region and in another districts.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Excuse me, can I just, because I can edit.
If it's connected?
Yeah, it's connected. I mean, to ask your first question.
Let's take another one.
Time-wise,
it's even better.
Yeah, it will be quicker.
Please,
so short question, because you are talking a lot about imitation. So as a kind of tool when it comes to, at least when it comes to short-term perspective. So my question is, so what is the role of the EU? I mean, of course, within ENP, Eastern Partnership, and so on in this case, because it sounds, at least when it comes to Europeanization literature, but imitation is a kind of issue connected not with the active role of the EU, is more with some actions at place, I mean, in one country, not necessarily with some active involvement of the EU and its institutions.
Do you
think have two questions?
Well, do you think should we collect if there's a third question and then we can choose what to answer?
I think we can stop at these two ones because we have 3 already, and then we'll go again.
All right. So in that case, thank you both very much for the questions. Right. Is EAP alive? Shortly, yes, it is, and will continue to be so. Why do I say that so confidently when it's been under such threat in the last few years? And when several have proclaimed it to indeed be dead or failed or what have you. It relates to the context of the European Global Strategy and the formulation of the EU's new primary foreign policy document, which to a certain extent we have been involved in Prague. In the process of doing this, the EU is really finding its identity as a foreign and security actor. It is very clear from the input of member states that the EU cannot be and should not be NATO, and should not be trying to be NATO. So therefore, how and what does the EU do? Well, it's back to the comprehensive approach again, and it's back exactly to tools like the neighbourhood policy, like the Eastern Partnership. But just because it's alive doesn't mean it's going to be the same, nor does it mean it's going to be effective. So these are the challenges, is to really animate it with the necessary spirit, and indeed what we might term the Zeitgeist rather than just the Zeitgeist, of exactly generosity and openness that will facilitate it to actually work. That is potentially more under threat from exactly this return to realism that Adam was talking about, the return to the factoring in of geostrategic interest and so on. in the BGS and ENP. So what is happening now is crucial for actually shaping that, but I'm not too pessimistic about that. In terms of imitation, performativity, well, I don't come from a Europeanisation or European studies literature background, as you can tell from some of the things I was quoting. I don't draw on that literature so much. When I talk about imitation, what I'm also talking about is performativity. And I'm talking about performative production of identity, which is always relational. And it's always an intersubjective construction of identity, so we don't do these things on our own. So when I'm talking about imitation from Ukrainians, it's in relation with the European Union, so that is inherently involving them in this process. But more specifically, yes, if I take your question in face value terms, yeah, we need to look much more at what the EU actually does and what the V4 can do to influence what the EU does in these processes. And I do discuss that a bit more. It is in some of the slides that we skipped through. But crucially, challenging ignorance and xenophobia amongst Western Europeans about Eastern Partnership countries, these devils that live in Western minds, as Nikita Gadan called them. But also in terms of challenging particular practices, challenging particular border features and so on. These are all things that the V4 can play a role in within the EU. The EU, more widely, we can see bigger processes at work with relation to mobility, migration, etc. And we have made quite a few concrete proposals for altering that from our institute, a paper we authored for the Prague European Summit back in November, including, for example, creating a European mobility ombudsman to factor in potential positive sides of mobility as well as threats and so on and so forth when considering migration, mobility and visa liberalisation. And there's many more I could aim for, but crucially one thing that links the two is the need to hold the EU to account in EU countries. So holding the EU to account for its visa processes, which it doesn't live up to. Secondly, holding the EU to account in Ukraine, challenging the kind of processes that happen through EU BAM and EU AM, as it now is, which effectively make Ukraine into a buffer zone. So we need to really challenge those things as well, and so that, again, the interrelational Ukraine-EU identity issue is there.
Thank you, Benjamin. Please.
Thank you for the question. Concerning the first question, I would divide stereotypes into two big groups, maybe local and maybe central overall. Concerning central stereotypes, the first and maybe the hardest to communicate stereotype is that the state will fail. Absolutely, we will face financial, economic disaster because the reform requires direct relations between the community and the center, and it's not absolutely ready. So it will become a situation when every single city mayor supposed to seek a budget every day, and everything is stopped in this village, you know. I think that it deals with the idea of Russian Federation to speak about federalization, yes, and to speak about not self-sufficient communities, absolutely not ready for this, not ready local elites. And by the way, that's a very interesting thing to see how local elites support this, because as much this elite has connection with the West, has connection with different sort of middle class enterprises, different sort of these things, they support decentralization, and vice versa. When they have planning economy in mind, they have one factory which officially is bankrupt, but still they have benefits from this factory. So that's another question. I believe that this very stereotype for the whole Ukrainian is a challenge. And again, we speak about decentralization on the whole as a process, not about the idea of any kind of a political party leader and so on. And if to speak about local, you know, the instruments of such stereotypes usually are the leaders, the heads of small councils in the village, because they lose their power and they like start to say, oh my God, it's not going to happen. It's like 10 years again speaking about nothing. You have your own life right now. It's just nothing to do with the reform. You know, the thing is that such local leaders, they are usually under secret service special interest, and sometimes we read different in newspapers official comments about such people who were judged or accused officially in doing something bad. Yes. So local stereotypes are just as the same as in any other region. I think that the reform has started. We face 1 year result. I think that the idea, which is to be in 2 years, is very clear and very optimistic, and we should all pay attention how to get these positions, how not to fail communities. They are already working. I think I remember that more than $50 billion dollars were spent for regional projects from the regional fund, which is co-organized by Ministry of Regional Development. So that's the real budget which can be spent by local communities. The other thing that if we will finish this level of giving responsibilities to all communities, and it must be more than 1,500 communities throughout Ukraine. Of course, in that moment we will face local elections because this will give them the right to step by step see the reform on the local level. You know, and maybe 2017 can be more appropriate, but not now. I see no reason.
But if I can clarify,
I think we have to stop, and I would like to thank very much our speakers for their excellent presentation, for which they deserve a round of applause, if I may.